I watched the bright yellow claw of the excavator descend upon my old wooden bridge, the metal teeth gleaming under the harsh morning sun. The air was thick with the smell of diesel and freshly disturbed earth, but beneath that was the faint, lingering scent of the old cedar planks that had carried 2 generations of traffic across the shallow, rocky creek. It wasn't a grand bridge, just a practical, single-lane span built decades ago by the original developer before the housing tracks sprawled out, connecting my quiet, isolated farmstead to the main public road. Now, it was scheduled for elimination by the very people who relied on it. Karen, the HOA president, stood not 20 feet away, supervising the crew with the severe, unblinking focus of a magistrate overseeing a public execution. She wore crisp white linen that stood out sharply against the mud, her expression a careful mixture of righteous satisfaction and barely concealed victory. This demolition was her crowning achievement in her campaign against unapproved structures and unsightly neglect. Never mind that the structure was fundamentally necessary. For 3 weeks, the passive-aggressive notes had been shoved into my mailbox, citing obscure bylaws from 1985 about material consistency and environmental impact. My calm, polite rebuttals, offering to repaint or repair it at my own expense, were dismissed with the frosty indifference only a hyper-authorized neighborhood volunteer can muster. They needed to tear it down, she'd declared at the last meeting, because it lowered the aesthetic property values, and replacing it with a community-approved pedestrian crossing would encourage walking. I had simply nodded, smiled faintly, and watched them proceed, keeping my silence and my secret close. My property, a deceptively large parcel that predated the entire subdivision, had been grandfathered in, its complex boundaries largely forgotten by the county and entirely ignored by the development company that founded the community. The machine let out a loud hydraulic groan, and the claw bit into the bridge's railing. The sound was a jarring, sickening crack, the sound of history being ripped apart. Dust flew up, and a flurry of brittle splinters rained down toward the creek. Karen, observing this act of destruction, adjusted the collar of her suit jacket with an air of complete vindication. She probably imagined herself as a modern Joan of Arc, cleansing the covenant of my inconvenient, rustic structure. The other members of the demolition crew, mostly board contractors, paused to drink lukewarm coffee, oblivious to the political theater playing out. I, however, felt a profound, cold sense of patience. They were destroying my wooden bridge, yes, but what they were really destroying was the tacit, decades-long agreement of access. The real key lay not in the bridge itself, but in the thin, snaking ribbon of land beneath it, and the few yards of dirt path on either side that formed the single viable entry point to their entire community. I reached into the breast pocket of my faded work shirt, my fingers brushing against the crisp, folded paper I had copied and notarized the day before legal reproduction of the original subdivision deed. The developer, in their hurry to maximize the number of buildable lots, had accidentally left a critical gap in the official property transfer, assuming the public road promised years ago would eventually be built. It never was. The map clearly showed that my parcel, described by an archaic meets and bounds survey, included the exact 30-foot wide strip of land that constituted the only de facto access road into the entire community, which just happened to necessitate the bridge they were now reducing to debris. I had known about the document for years, a quiet ace up my sleeve, but only now. With the irrevocable termination of their existing use, could I play it? With a final, terrible crunch, the main support beam collapsed. The excavator swung the heavy, tangled wreckage aside, leaving a smoking, impassable chasm where the bridge used to be. The creek flowed freely, but the hundreds of homes on the other side were now officially marooned. Karen's celebratory, slightly condescending smile was still fixed in place as she gave the thumbs up to the foreman. She had won the battle over my unapproved structure, but I had won the war over their entire neighborhood's access. Every single one of their 100-plus homes was suddenly cut off from the main highway. I felt the cold, hard weight of immense, unexpected leverage settle in my gut. My simple act of watching the demolition crew work was over. Now, the real work, the calculation of the new mandatory rodeos fee began. The chaos started subtly, a ripple that grew into a tidal wave of suburban panic. For the first hour, everything seemed normal to the residents. It was mid-morning, most were at work, and the few who were home assumed the heavy equipment noise was routine maintenance. But then the first school bus arrived at the newly formed edge of the chasm, and seeing its route abruptly and completely severed, had to execute a clumsy 3-point turn on the narrow dirt path. This was quickly followed by a line of delivery vans, FedEx, UPS, Amazon, all realizing simultaneously that the planned 5-minute stop was now an insurmountable obstacle. The drivers, frustrated by the total lack of signage or warning, began calling their dispatchers, who in turn started calling the HOA. The realization was dawning. There was no detour. The creek, though narrow, was too deep and its banks too steep for any vehicle to cross, and the access road itself simply ended at the water. Having relied on my bridge for decades, by noon, the situation had escalated from an inconvenience to a minor emergency. A delivery of essential medical equipment for an elderly resident was halted. 2 garbage trucks sat idle on the main road, their scheduled route unserviceable. The most telling sign was the cluster of teenagers, recently dropped off early from school due to an unexpected power outage, now forced to hike a mile and a half around the entire perimeter of the property, dragging their backpacks through unfamiliar brush, just to get home. The HOA's internal group chat, Karen's usual weapon of communication, went from serene announcements about the upcoming annual barbecue to a firestorm of angry capitalized demands, and frantic inquiries. Where was the temporary pedestrian bridge? Why wasn't a bypass road planned? Karen, in her first attempt to manage the disaster, instructed everyone to remain calm and refer to the planned community improvements, a directive that was immediately mocked, as the only improvement so far was a deep, muddy hole. My phone, which I had silenced and placed on my kitchen counter, began to light up the glass surface with an aggressive, continuous buzzing. It was a symphony of modern distress. I let it ring. I wasn't interested in talking to a panicked community. I was interested in talking to the person solely responsible for the current state of affairs. I brewed a cup of coffee and settled into my porch chair, watching the growing collection of vehicles idling near the creek, their drivers gesticulating wildly. The demolition crew had packed up and left, leaving the wreckage behind, their job technically complete. They had been hired to tear down a bridge, and they had. The fact that their work had marooned over 100 families was above their pay grade. Finally, after 2 hours of self-imposed solitude, the phone call I was waiting for came. The screen displayed Karen, HOA president, in large, red letters. I answered on the 3rd ring. "This is the homeowner," I stated simply. My voice even. Her greeting was not a greeting at all, but a sharp, cutting question. "What in God's name is happening? My neighbors are reporting absolute pandemonium. Where is the alternate access?" This bridge was a necessary access point. Her carefully constructed authoritative tone was frayed at the edges, a thin veneer over a growing dread. I could hear the background noise of car horns and shouting over her speaker. It was a necessary access point. "Karen," I corrected her mildly, "and as of an hour ago, that necessary access point, which ran directly over my land, was permanently terminated by your association." The line went silent for a moment, a heavy static-filled pause. When she spoke again, her voice dropped, adopting a dangerously low, manipulative pitch. "This is ridiculous. You are obligated to allow access." "We had an easement," I sighed, a long audible sound of weary patience. "You might have, but the document you used to justify destroying my bridge also terminated any existing use agreement, and you failed to secure a new one with me, the landowner. I warned you about this multiple times." Her voice rose again, higher and tighter. "I demand that you meet with me right now at the clubhouse. We need to find the paperwork and get a temporary solution in place." I took a slow sip of my coffee, savoring the moment of complete control. "I'm afraid not. I'm quite busy, but I will meet with you. At my house. I have the relevant documents you are looking for, but they are tucked away in a less than accessible location. You can be here in 15 minutes, or you can start explaining to the fire chief why his trucks can't get past the creek." She tried to argue, but I simply repeated the condition, then hung up. She would come. Her desperation was a palpable bitter perfume on the wires, and I knew she had no other choice. Precisely 17 minutes later, a sleek, pearl-white SUV with vanity plates pulled up my gravel driveway, kicking up a cloud of pale dust that quickly settled over the overgrown weeds. Karen emerged, looking slightly disheveled but still attempting to project an image of impeccable, effortless power. Her white linen jacket had a faint smudge near the cuff, and her hair, usually held in a tight, structured style, had several strands pulled loose by the wind or perhaps by the sheer force of her anxiety. She strode toward the porch with purpose, her heels crunching aggressively on the loose stone, a clear intent to dominate this unexpected meeting. I met her at the door, but did not offer a hand or an invitation to sit. Her eyes immediately scanned the rustic entryway, lingering perhaps a beat too long on the scuffed floorboards and the non-designer furniture, mentally cataloging the ways in which my home failed to meet her neighborhood's standards. "Where are the documents?" she demanded, bypassing any greeting, her voice brittle with urgency. She carried a slim, expensive leather briefcase, clearly ready to assume her role as the organized professional who would swiftly rectify my rural stubbornness. "They're not down here," I said calmly, already turning toward the main staircase. "They're put away safely. Follow me." I led her through the kitchen and into the central hall, deliberately forcing her to walk past the dogs, chew toys, and a pile of muddy boots. The climb began a long, creaking ascent to the 3rd floor, a part of the house Karen would never normally acknowledge existed. She was accustomed to meetings in air-conditioned conference rooms, where she stood behind a polished podium. This climb was physical, forcing her to expend effort, breathing hard as her pristine heels struggled on the old wooden steps. The climb was slow torture for her. With every upward step, she left her authority further behind. The 2nd floor was bad enough, smelling faintly of old wood and dust, but the 3rd floor landing led to a sight that made her visibly blanch. A low, narrow access door barely 6 feet tall, secured with a simple hook-on-die latch. It was the entrance to the attic. "We're going in there?" she asked, her voice squeaking slightly with distaste. She instinctively tried to check her composure in the reflection of a framed, faded landscape painting on the wall. "That's where the oldest documents are stored," I confirmed, pulling the latch. I had to duck slightly to step inside, but for Karen, who was taller and more stiffly dressed, the entry was a full-bodied humiliation. She had to hinge herself at the waist, twisting her neck to avoid hitting the low-ceiling joist, her linen jacket scraping against the dusty, splintered doorframe. Her face was a mask of utter revulsion as the thick, stale air of the storage space enveloped her. The attic was oppressively warm, illuminated only by a single, bare bulb dangling from a cord and the slanted beams of light that filtered through the narrow vents, turning the floating dust motes into shimmering golden tunnels. The space was packed with decades of forgotten possessions, antique furniture shrouded in white cloths, towers of yellow and cardboard boxes, and rolls of musty carpet. I had cleared a small area near the central support column, and placed a single, worn wooden chair next to an old steamer trunk. "Have a seat," I instructed, gesturing to the trunk, forcing her to choose between sitting on the uncomfortable dusty relic or remaining standing and awkwardly hunched over. She chose the trunk, sitting stiffly, balancing her expensive briefcase on her lap, her posture ruined. The dust, the heat, the lack of control, it was all designed to dismantle the HOA president and reveal the vulnerable, trapped woman underneath. The silence, broken only by her strained, shallow breathing, was now mine. I walked over to a stack of military footlockers hidden beneath a heavy quilt and returned to the center of the attic. From the lockbox, I produced 2 items: the heavily wrinkled, oversized original survey map from 1957, yellowed and smelling distinctly of dried ink and forgotten basements, and the crisp, certified copy of the deed I had pulled from my pocket hours earlier. I did not sit down. I unfolded the map first, smoothing the brittle paper over the lid of the steamer trunk right beside Karen's manicured hands. The map was confusing, full of handwritten annotations and compass bearings, but the key detail was impossible to miss. A thin, unlabeled strip of land clearly cutting through the heart of the modern community, a strip labeled only with my family's old land parcel number, P41A. I tapped the exact point where the access road crossed the creek. Now, a massive, muddy gap. "This," I stated, my voice low and completely devoid of emotion, "is where your old bridge was. And this narrow parcel of land, encompassing the entire dirt track leading from the main road to the creek bed, and 20 feet past the creek bed on the other side, belongs to me. The developer never secured it. They were waiting for the county road they promised and simply built the bridge and started selling lots, assuming a public easement would follow. It never did. The community has operated under a revocable implied license for decades, a license that existed only as long as I didn't object to the presence of your structure, the bridge, on my private property." Karen's eyes, initially wide with confusion, narrowed into slits of sharp, legal understanding as I spoke the key phrase. She reached for the map, trying to trace the boundary lines herself, but I gently placed the deed copy on top of it, and this is the deed, recently refiled and confirmed by a title attorney last week. It confirms the exact boundaries of P41A. I paused, letting the dusty heat of the attic do its work. "When your association used its authority, citing my bridge as a violation of your covenants, you didn't just remove an unapproved structure, you explicitly repudiated the decades-old implied license for access. You terminated it. You tore down my bridge, Karen, and by doing so, you legally and irrevocably closed the only road to your neighborhood." She snatched up the deed copy, her fingers trembling slightly, her composure finally beginning to fracture. She muttered words like squatters' rights and adverse possession legal threats that, under the circumstances, sounded utterly hollow. "We will sue you. This is extortion. You cannot hold a community of hundreds of families hostage." I waited patiently for her outburst to subside. "You can sue all you want. The paperwork proves continuous ownership and tax payments for 70 years, and your own official paperwork was used to initiate the demolition, which means your association acknowledged and acted upon the status of the structure as a private fixture, not a public asset. You legally severed your own lifeline." I reached into my pocket and pulled out a single, folded sheet of lined paper, not a legal document, but a simple piece of notebook paper. "Now, the immediate crisis is access for emergency services and garbage collection. I'm willing to immediately grant a temporary 3-day emergency use license to allow construction of a footbridge and temporary access for essential vehicles only." Her face lit up with relief, a desperate flash of hope. "But the permanent resolution requires a formal, permanent easement to rebuild a functional road and bridge. And for the inconvenience, the loss of my private quietude, and the cost of maintaining my now public access strip, the price for that permanent easement is steep, very steep." I waited one last agonizing beat before reading the numbers clearly. The association must pay a road's fee of $5 million to secure the permanent right-of-way, immediately. Furthermore, The association must fully fund and construct a brand Tulane County-approved bridge and permanently exempt my property from all future HOA dues and assessments, in perpetuity. Her eyes darted from my face to the paper, and the numerical figure, handwritten in large, black ink, seemed to suck all the stale air from the attic. $5 million was far more than the HOA's entire reserve fund. It was an existential figure that would require special assessments of tens of thousands of dollars per home. The heat, the dust, the sudden weight of the lit was too much. The mighty HOA president went completely still, her briefcase slipping from her lap to hit the floor with a muffled thud. The thud of the leather briefcase was the sound of Karen's entire world fracturing. She stared at the handwritten $5 million, her mouth slightly ajar, the dust motes dancing mockingly in the bare bulb's light. Her denial, the last weapon of a privileged mind, gave way to a chilling, immediate understanding of ruin. I pushed a notary's pen across the steamer trunk and placed the temporary license in front of her. That paper is the only thing standing between your community and the county declaring a state of emergency, which would legally justify me boarding up the road entirely for public safety concerns. You sign this now, and essential services get through for the next 72 hours. We'll discuss the $5 million later with your counsel, but this, Karen, is not debatable. The urgency in my voice was real. I didn't want innocent people suffering, only those who had inflicted the injury. She didn't look at me, only at the document, tracing the signature line with a trembling finger. Her pride was gone, replaced by the instinct of survival for her career and reputation. With a shaky hand, Karen scrawled her name as the duly authorized president, making the first concession, confirming the private nature of the road, and taking the full burden of her mistake. The long descent from the attic was even more silent and somber than the climb. Karen moved like a ghost, the weight of the $5 million assessment settling onto her shoulders with every creak of the old staircase. When she finally reached the front door, she didn't offer a goodbye or a threat, only a promise. You will hear from our attorney by the end of the business day. I simply nodded and watched her retreat to her pristine white SUV, the vehicle disappearing down the dusty gravel road that she now knew belonged unequivocally to me. By late afternoon, the temporary license had done its job. A small, prefabricated footbridge was being hauled across the creek, allowing paramedics to finally reach the neighborhood, and the garbage trucks were scheduled for a late evening run. But the temporary relief did nothing to stem the rising tide of fury. The emergency HOA board meeting that evening was predictably a catastrophic spectacle. Karen, attempting to maintain her authority, presented the facts, the deed, the mistake, and my demand in the sterile language of legal exposure. But the board members, facing the prospect of being personally blamed and financially ruined, didn't want facts. They wanted a scapegoat. The documents I provided, including the HOA's own signed demolition notice, were proof of her singular, arrogant blunder. The very people who had once cheered her crusade against my unsightly bridge now turned on her with a viciousness born of panic. Within hours, a motion was passed to censure and immediately remove Karen from the presidency, followed by a formal public apology drafted to me, the landowner. Karen's reign over the community was terminated, ironically, not by a hostile takeover, but by the legal implications of a bridge she insisted on tearing down. The community's hired corporate lawyer, a slick man who specialized in minimizing damages, spent the next week in a futile effort to find an unrecorded easement, an error in my deed, or any legal loophole. The result was always the same. My property was clearly held, and the HOA's decision to demolish the bridge was the final, fatal action that forfeited any implied access rights. The lawyer presented the board with the inescapable reality: a drawn-out, expensive lawsuit would be far more costly than my ransom, and in the meantime, their homes were functionally worthless, their property values having cratered the moment the bridge fell. Faced with financial annihilation, the board authorized the immediate negotiation for the permanent easement. I signed the final documents a week later in the county recorder's office. Far from the dusty attic, the terms were met. A substantial wire transfer of the Rodu's fee hit my bank account, a check that secured my financial freedom. More satisfyingly, the deed was officially amended, permanently designating my property as exempt from all future HOA covenants and assessments. I was free. 3 days later, the sound of heavy machinery returned, but this time, it was the constructive rumble of cranes and concrete mixers beginning the Tulane, steel-reinforced bridge that the community was now required to build on my newly deeded right-of-way. I often stood on my porch, drinking coffee, watching the workers lay the foundations, a peaceful, private sentinel guarding the expensive access they had so carelessly destroyed. My quiet life had been restored, but this time, it was built on a foundation of ironclad legal documents and $5 million worth of very expensive revenge. If you enjoyed the shocking drama of this HOA nightmare, be sure to check out HOA Bright Reality on YouTube. For more real-life stories and legal lessons, please remember to like, share, comment, and subscribe to the channel.